Hi everyone. Today we will discuss mass media and culture of the 1920s. The warm up has to do with this video about women called flappers. And as we watch, I would like you to think about the question, how did flappers change women's lives in the 1920s? So let me link up this video here, this one, for you to watch. Keep in mind the question, how did women change the 1920s? How did these women called flappers change the
Women were
1920s?
experiencing a new sense of freedom and independence in the 1920s. Who were these women? How did they express this newfound freedom? Women had gained the right to vote in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment seemed to usher in the new decade, an era in which a new breed of liberated, modern woman became one of the most celebrated icons of the time. The new woman became known as a flapper. Flappers were young women who abandoned the traditional Victorian era values of their parents and grandparents. The word flapper came from the United Kingdom. It was a slang term for an impetuous teenage girl. Flappers were known for a distinctive appearance and manner of dress. They cut their hair short, wearing a haircut known as a bobbed cut. They also wore straight, loose-fitting dresses with bare arms and low necklines. The dress length usually stopped just below the knee. At the time, such a short dress or skirt would have been considered risque. This allowed the young women to perform new dance steps such as the Charleston or the shimmy. When dancing, the length of their dresses would allow for an occasional glimpse of the bare knees, which would have been scandalous just a decade before. Large amounts of jewelry also made up part of the flapper costume. Several layers of beaded necklaces, pins, rings, and brooches were also common. Flappers typically wore large amounts of makeup, including lipstick, eyeliner, and blush. Makeup became increasingly more common throughout the decade as manufacturers continued to make a wider variety of cosmetics. Stockings also went out of fashion, and many older women were shocked when they saw young flappers out in public with bare legs. However, being a flapper was more than just a choice of clothing and jewelry. It was a way of life. The flappers engaged in many different types of behavior that, at the time, were not deemed as ladylike. They rode bicycles, drove automobiles, listened to jazz music, smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, and danced. There were many slang terms that became associated with the flapper culture. Terms such as the bee's knees, the cat's pajamas, and that's so Jake were all known to mean fantastic. The big cheese might be used to describe an important person, while broad, dame, or doll were all used to describe a woman. Not everyone was a fan of the flappers. There were many people who were outspoken against them and felt that they were ruining the nation. Some critics felt that their style of dress was not only improper, but near nakedness. They were often criticized as being flippant, unintelligent, and reckless.
All right, so we've make sure you think about that question before I discuss it. Pause if you need to. But we learned about how one of the ways that women labeled as flappers changed the culture was through fashion changes, through working more often outside of the home, um, through dancing and that kind of culture. Those are a few possible answers there. Now that we have your warm up done, we're going to do these slides on mass media and culture of the 1920s. Then you have a choice activity, and we have the exit ticket, which pertains to this question. How do 1920s literature, art, and music demonstrate the cultural conflicts facing the United States? The 20s women. After the turmoil of World War I, Americans were looking for a little fun in the 1920s. Women were becoming more independent and achieving greater freedoms, like the right to vote, more employment, freedom of the auto. How do you think life would be different for women of color as compared to white women? Well, I'll see. I'll have this typed out for you in a future slide. Make sure you pause to think if necessary anytime I have a question on here. Women of color have likely been working outside of the home for generations, whether in during slavery and after slavery through sharecropping and supporting the family in that way. More recently, perhaps as teachers or for Black owned businesses. So, for that group of people, is less likely to be a new phenomenon to be working outside of the home. They'll also be facing unique barriers to voting, which white women might not be facing as often. During the 1920s, a new ideal emerged for some women called the flapper. Flapper was an emancipated or free young woman who embraced new fashions and urban attitudes. What does that word urban mean? It means city. Black women were already working outside their homes in fields as sharecroppers. Remember, what is sharecropping? That's essentially a system where the farmer will pay workers to work their field, but those workers would live on the farmer's land and pay rent back to the farmer. So the profits for the people working that land as sharecroppers were extremely minimal, and the profit for the landowner, the farmer, was maximal. Just look at this writing really quickly on this slide. Take a moment to read over yourself. Many Black women also worked as teachers and other roles in Black owned companies. Fast changing world of the 1920s produced new roles for women. Many women entered the workplace as nurses, teachers, librarians, and secretaries. However, women earned less than men and were kept out of many traditional male jobs like management and faced discrimination. The 19th Amendment, remember real quick, what is the 18th Amendment? That prohibited alcohol. So during this time period, alcohol would be illegal. The 19th Amendment was passed in 1920 after the government acknowledged the contributions of women during World War I. They removed gender restrictions for voting by allowing women to vote. Except in Western states where they were a cherished minority, women rarely had a voice in government. More people and women were represented after the passing of the 19th Amendment, which created a more democratic government. Overall, how did women challenge the traditional culture of American society in the 1920s? We have new voices in government, new roles for democracy, new roles working outside of the home, and cultural changes like fashion and dancing. Welfare capitalism occurs when real income increases. There are higher rate for owners, managers, skilled laborers, and minimal increased rates for unskilled labor and working class people. Insurance, profit sharing, and worker safety, as well as the decreased influence of unions, was also part of this welfare capitalism. Mass production includes a wide variety and availability of consumer products at affordable prices, like the Model T. What is the Model T? It's a car. Domestic appliances. This also includes installment plans and the impact of the automobile. Why did cars become more accessible to the average people in the 1920s? Because of the assembly line, they became more easily manufactured and therefore cheaper for the average person. Here are some examples of some consumer ads from the 1920s. Take just a moment to look over each of these. How do these compare to modern day ads? Most ads now are actually digital, like video or a digital picture, rather than printed ads. There's more limited printed ads today. But the concepts are largely the same. So you'll see a message asking the viewer to purchase something, whether it's a visual message or some written text. Probably today's ads have a bit less written text than the one in the upper left and the one in the lower right. More like these two would be the amount of text that would be seen as acceptable to really draw in a viewer today with a shorter attention span, likely. Access to electricity provided American households the power to run all sorts of new labor saving devices. How's this going to impact women? Women are going to be able to spend less time in the home taking care of it, less time on that sorts of cleaning, and instead they will be able to spend more time perhaps getting involved in politics or working or engaging in hobbies and pop culture. Ads in magazines and newspapers pushed new products like refrigerators, irons, toasters, and vacuums. Our warm up tomorrow for the next class day is going to be about this. The popularity and affordability of the automobile changed the face of America. Families moved to the suburbs and could commute to work in the cities. But not all people were able to move to the suburbs easily. Why might people of color struggle with moving to the suburbs in the 1920s? There is still legalized segregation, legalized discrimination. So a housing company could prohibit people of color from buying houses within a suburban neighborhood. Doctors could now use automobiles to make house calls. Police departments retired their horses and bought cars. Driving vacations became popular, resulting in thousands of restaurants and ice cream parlors opening across the United States. Auto-related industries like gas, steel, glass, tires, and other carports and services started to grow to support the increasing success of automobiles. Do you think that all families would have been welcome in the suburbs in the 1920s? Why or why not? Kind of went over this a bit already. As always, pause, think. They would not. There was still a lot of discrimination, a lot of imposed fear of people who didn't look like other groups of people, like stigma against other groups of people that was extremely negative and would prevent people from moving wherever they liked during this time period. We'll see this trend continuing throughout the 1950s and seeing some success towards more equality in the 60s. American birth rates declined for several decades before the 1920s. What larger impacts would decreasing birth rates have on American society? Going to have a smaller, younger workforce, a lot less people. Um, as this population ages, there will be less people to care for that aging population. We're seeing that effect today as well. During the 1920s, that trend for less birth rates increased as birth control information became widely available. Birth control clinics opened, and the American Birth Control League, founded by Margaret Sanger, was founded in 1921. What would traditionalists and modernists each think about increased access to birth control? So we see, remember that we learned about the other day, back up my previous videos, to learn a little bit more about traditionalists and modernists. Traditionalists would not appreciate this increased access. They would likely cite it as against their religion or against God's will. But modernists would like this access to birth control because they're embracing scientific change and they're wanting more freedom and control. As the 1920s unfolded, many features of the modern family emerged. Marriage became based on romantic love, women managed households and finances, and children were no longer considered laborers or wage earners, but rather developing children who needed nurturing and education. How is this different from previous generations? Sometimes marriages would be based on partnerships, loyalty between families, it could be about financial situations, And often we saw a lot of struggles in the early 1900s with child labor. So remember that the progressivist presidents were helping to ban child labor or make it harder for companies to get away with child labor. So that's one of the things that pushed this change. Previous generations, the children would have been working to contribute to the home. During the 1920s, developments in education had a powerful impact on the nation. Enrollments in high schools quadrupled between 1914 and 1926. Public schools met the challenge of educating millions of immigrants, but schools are segregated. How might education be different in schools with white students versus schools with students of color? Pause to think. These schools would not be given equal resources. Schools with mainly students of color likely would have had older textbooks, less experienced teachers, um, less funding for things like school buses or outreach programs to help families in need and things like that. As literacy increased, newspaper circulation rose and mass circulation magazines flourished. How often do you all read newspapers or magazines today? Probably not that often. We get our news in different ways now. Perhaps digital newspapers or magazines. More likely, you even can get news on like TikTok accounts, and just YouTube videos, podcasts, things like that are probably more common than having a newspaper or magazine delivered to your house. But by the end of the 1920s, 10 American magazines, including Reader's Digest and Time, boosted circulations of over 2 million. Although print media was popular, radio was the most powerful communications medium to emerge in the 1920s. Radios delivered news faster and to a larger audience. Americans could hear the voice of the president or listen to the World Series live. How do you think that the radio could possibly change politics? This is a question I want you to keep in mind for future lessons as well. The president, as you can see in the bullet directly above that, can now speak over the radio to the general public. Before this, many Americans probably had never heard the voice of a president, besides those who are really involved and go to their rallies or things like that. Now, everyday Americans can feel more connected to politics and their president themselves. How often do you all listen to the radio now? I never listened to the radio. Maybe even 5 years ago, I would have said I listened to it, like in the car casually, but now I never do. However, same as the newspaper and magazines bullet, it was one of the main forms of um, entertainment, engagement about 100 years ago. In 1929, Americans spent $4.5 billion on entertainment, including sports. How do you think this spending compared to today's spending? It's pretty like equivalent proportion wise. Of course, we spend billions more on entertainment now, but there's been considerable inflation in the past 100 years, and there are more forms of entertainment now to spend money on. People crowded into baseball games to see their heroes, such as Babe Ruth. He was a larger than life American hero who played for the Yankees. He hit 60 home runs in 1 year of 1927. Black people were also welcome to play baseball and very much respected within their communities. However, they had to play in a separate league. Writer F. Scott Fitzgerald coined the phrase jazz age to describe the 1920s. Fitzgerald wrote Paradise Lost and The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby reflected the emptiness of New York elite society. Who here has read The Great Gatsby or seen the movie? I actually have not, but I hope to soon. It seems like a great movie. The Great Migration of African American people from southern rural country to northern urban city areas was the result of push and pull factors. Jim Crow laws and lynchings. What are lynchings? That's a brutal death of brutal murder, really, of someone, but it's passed off as a punishment for a crime. Unfortunately, nearly always targeted towards people of color. So these Jim Crow laws, lynchings, as well as economic hardships of sharecropping and a lack of alternative economic opportunities promoted many people to leave the South. Job opportunities in the factories, especially during World War I, brought African American people to the cities of the North and the Midwest. Between 1910 and 1920, the Great Migration saw hundreds of thousands of African American people move north to big cities. Why are people moving north? We just went over it on the last slide. Economic hardships, Jim Crow laws, lynchings. Those are just a few reasons. By 1920, over 5 million of the nation's 12 million Black people, which is over 40% of the population, lived in cities. Describe the Harlem Renaissance. This is going to be a concept that you have to remember for your exams. So you can go back up if you don't remember here. It's this movement of many African American people moving to the cities, and learn a little bit more about it from this video. Let's take a look. So remember, from this video, I want you to be able to describe the Harlem Renaissance. That's the goal here.
The Harlem Renaissance is one of the most iconic cultural periods in African American history. Throughout the decade of the 1920s, Black writing, art, and music flourished, ushering in a cultural revolution that rocked the United States.
One of the most important factors that accounted for the rise of what we know of as the Harlem Renaissance is the migration of Black peoples from the South to urban centers like Harlem.
The Jim Crow era began after Reconstruction, and every Southern African American had to think about, what should we do? Should we go or should we stay? For many of these people, it was a matter of life and death, literally.
Sometimes in the most repressive times, we create the most extraordinary art.
Amidst the fervor of the Great Migration, bold, exciting forms of Black music evolved, along with venues to listen and dance to this music. Blues and jazz clubs became a central part of life in Harlem, where artists such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, Bessie and Mamie Smith rose to prominence.
Began to cry. He went away and never even said goodbye.
The era also saw the burgeoning of literary work by and about African Americans, which the writer Alain Locke compiled into an anthology. He called it The New Negro, and its name came to define a movement.
The Harlem Renaissance is a facet of a larger movement that we think of as the New Negro movement, where you have a new generation of Black people, by this point, 2 generations out of slavery, using the arts as a way to help people gain broader civil and political rights.
Some of the framers of what became the Renaissance make the argument that the artistic worth of a people has to be proven by the worth of the art and literature they produced, especially for people that historically, over centuries, have been defined as without culture, without history, without any record of achievement.
The Harlem Renaissance is the flowering of creativity that had been suppressed for centuries. People that had the sense that things were opening up, and finally, we can be the people that we imagine ourselves to be.
All right. So, part of the era of the Harlem Renaissance, I really want you to recall the Harlem Renaissance as a time of emerging culture for the African American people, emerging art culture, music, literature, and those aspects of culture. However, also during this time period, we see new goals for African American people. In 1909, the NAACP urged African American people to protest racial violence. W.E.B. Du Bois, a founding member, led a march of 10,000 Black men to New York to protest the violence. Marcus Garvey was also part of this movement. He believed that African American people should build a separate society in Africa. What is the argument for this? Why would he fight for this? He believes that the United States perhaps can never be accommodating enough to African American people for it to truly be a home for them. So they're looking to create a different type of society where they can truly be themselves. In 1914, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey claimed 1 million members by the mid-1920s. He left a powerful legacy of Black pride, economic independence, and Pan-Africanism. Garvey represented a more radical approach. Harlem, New York became the largest Black urban community. Harlem did suffer from overcrowding, unemployment, and poverty. However, in the 1920s, it was home to a literary and artistic revival known as the Harlem Renaissance. Who can name some influential Black artists or authors, whether or not they live in this time period? Let's learn about some of them. Oops. We have Louis Armstrong. Jazz was born in the early 20th century, and in 1922, a young trumpet player named Louis Armstrong joined the Creole Jazz Band. Later, he joined Fletcher Henderson's band in New York City. Armstrong is considered the most important and influential musician in the history of jazz. From evidence of new artists like Louis Armstrong, what can we learn about the Black community as a whole? Getting more opportunities to express music, writing, dancing, things that they may not have had an opportunity to work on and pursue when they were trapped more in the systems of slavery or sharecropping. I skipped this slide by mistake. Why might some Black people at the time want to live in communities with a majority population of other Black people? Could be possible that they feel more safe around people who look like them or have similar shared past experiences. There's a lot of racism still thriving during this time. So it could be possible that, of course, not only are some of the white communities not welcoming to people of color, but it might seem like very exciting to have a place to go that's truly developing a culture of people who are similar to themselves and very much of a pride within that. There are multiple things you could talk about there. All right, now we are going to complete the Mass Media and Culture choice activity from Canvas. You're going to complete this activity individually. Choose one of the following 5 options. All options ask you to explore a website to determine answers to 15 questions. They are the same length, so please choose the topic that you are most interested in, and then click on the topic title to make a copy of the document. So we've got the options for today are modern youth, modern women, modern democracy, modern faith, and modern cities. So you will choose one of those to complete. And then our exit ticket for today. These are questions that you could see again. Number 1, how do the ideas of modern and traditional values and the cultural changes that we discussed today help define the Roaring Twenties? How did 1920s literature, art, and music reflect the cultural conflicts facing the United States? How did the Great Migration impact African American people prior to the end of World War I? And describe the literary works created during the 1920s. Those are the questions I'd like you to think about as we are closing out. Thank you all so much.